to our hashtag Africa Focus feature. This is part of the show where we look at some of the biggest stories on the African continent. And this time around, we'll be focusing on Kenya, where for millions of Kenyans, Saba Saba has become more than just a date on the calendar. It marks the historic 7th of July, 1980, when ordinary citizens took to the streets demanding multi-party democracy in the East African nation and just general political reform. And more than 3 decades later, the same date has once again become a symbol of resistance, but also of confrontation. This year's commemoration saw Nairobi effectively in lockdown, with heavy police deployments, roadblocks, arrests, and reports of journalists being obstructed as authorities move to prevent large-scale demonstrations. Human rights groups have raised fresh concerns about freedom of assembly, police conduct, and just general media freedom under Kenyan President William Ruto's administration. And to help us understand what unfolded yesterday on the ground in Kenya, we're joined from Nairobi by Kenya-based journalist with the Standard Group, Alex Channy Kiarie. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Good morning.
Good morning, and I hope everyone is okay over there.
No, we are well. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we kickstart the conversation, just give us a bit more background on the Saba Saba and the events of yesterday. This is especially for our listeners who are outside of Kenya that want to get a bit of explanation and insight on the significance of Saba Saba Day.
So Saba in Swahili means 7, just like it is in Arabic, Sabea. And as we all know, 7th of July comes on the 7th month of the year. And the whole history of this day is steeped in the 1982 coup attempt that happened over there and lasted for around 8 hours before it was crushed by government loyalist forces. And it is during this time, during the regime of Kanu and then President Daniel Arap Moi, that is thought to have been more choleric against opponents. And this in itself forced proponents of democracy to escalate their push for the introduction of multi-party democracy, which now came on the 7th of July 1990, when over 30 protesters were killed while trying to access various grounds across the country to push for this. And it actually worked because despite all that and the international pressure that came after the killing of the protesters by the police, the international community pushed the then regime of Daniel Arap Moi to reintroduce and the multi-party politics in the country after the repealing of the Section 2A of the then Kenyan Constitution, which had prohibited other parties apart from KANU, which was then leading the country, and allowed for the 1992 elections, which of course was won by the then ruling party. But still, in itself, it has since been one of those days that have been put on in the Kenyan calendar as a day when democracy finally prevailed, and the detentions without trial that was so endemic during those days also came to an end, and other human rights and democratic milestones were achieved. It is still a very important day, although it has come now in a new way because it is still now being used as a force of agitating for new reforms and sticking to the constitution that was passed in 2010 rather, and which many Kenyans view as being violated by the current regime under President William Ruto, who has allegedly, or who is being seen to be using parliament to roll back the gains made from those agitations of 1982, 1990, and also 1997, when he had the interparliamentary group, which also saw so many reforms made, especially affecting the most the elections that have been happening since 1997.
No, thank you so much for that background. I want to come back to the atmosphere in Nairobi yesterday. If you can just paint a picture for our listeners what you witnessed as that day was commemorated, and people once again, as you mentioned, used the 7th of July to once again agitate for change and to try and put government, shall we say, under pressure to do what they're mandated to do.
Exactly. You see, if you recall last year's first anniversary of the 25th June protest that saw Parliament breached, a protester was shot within the city center of Nairobi. He was actually selling masks, and he was brazenly shot dead under the glare of cameras and journalists. So this is because during last year's first commemoration on 25th of June, there were protests that were really massive, and the government was overwhelmed. In some areas, in some estates, the army was called in to quell protests after the police were overwhelmed. So the subsequent Saba Saba elections were pegged on the reforms that the Gen Zs were pushing for. So this year, just like it happened last month during the same commemorations of June 25, the government practically locked down the entire city, not just in Nairobi, but also in other towns. And the city center was practically inaccessible. And it is seen that the government was also afraid that similar protests will be witnessed, and that's why many roads leading towards the Nairobi Central Business District were locked down, and motorists prevented from accessing them. Schools remained shut, and even businesses too were not in operation. This is because the government was fearing this thing that now we call goons, which is more of like the criminalization of counter protests by some politicians, so that they don't access the city center and loot or burn any shops or any businesses, or maybe even rob people who had managed to access the central business district. So it was basically being alleged actually by some people that it was the government protesting because clearly there was no interest in by Genesis to cause any kind of infiltration that was witnessed last year, and in itself it was a government disrupting operations within the country, and also especially within the capital Nairobi. So basically, no
Mm.
motorists were being allowed until late in the afternoon when they realized that there were no more protesters trying to access or rather stage any protests. Then they opened them. But clearly, businesses were disrupted, and not very many Kenyans are very happy with the whole thing.
We've also seen reports of arrests and restrictions affecting journalists. How difficult was it for the media to cover events on the ground? Were they also targeted?
Yes, basically, this is the government that is trying to stop journalists from exposing the police officers who were involved in human rights violation. So what they do is that they prevent access to some of the areas of operations, and areas where politicians, those who were involved in the 1990 agitation, were holding a commemoration service from accessing. Because I recall that there is one activist who was also who was arrested on camera while the politicians were addressing the press on the importance of the day. So basically, it's just something that has been happening and has been gradual, but now it's a reality that most media houses are now living with, because remember that in the aftermath of the June 25 protests, the government of President Ruto went to parliament and passed a cyber crimes law, which was meant to clamp down on any kind of expression, especially in the social media platforms. The same
Mm.
ruling that was made last week, which ruled it as unconstitutional, because this is steeped in the section 1 and 2 of the Kenyan Constitution under the Bill of Rights, and for any change to be made, there should be a referendum to that. But the government managed to pass it and has been operating with on impunity, because it is not. It's actually unconstitutional. Kenyans are free to express themselves through the media, and there is the freedom of the media, of the press, is enshrined in the Kenyan constitution. And this clearly is the reason why the government does not want this to come out as such, because it is already been ruled as unconstitutional, and they are still going on with it and going ahead with suppressing the media, especially social media platforms, where activists had harnessed this thing and used it to push the government to the edge. But now most of them have since been abducted. Others have gone silent rather, while others have been compromised.
And lastly, before I let you go, the culture and the nature of protests in Kenya, particularly those that are led by young people, quote unquote Gen Zs, I think has um, become almost a standard for holding government accountability for other African countries. Where does that come from? This, fearlessness, from young people in Kenya to, despite the dangers that are associated with some of these protests, to continue, flooding the streets and making sure that the protests are impactful and the message to the Kenyan government is received and the whole world almost gives attention to what's happening on the ground in Kenya. Where does this come from? And this culture of protest and then holding government accountable?
I can rank it in two. The first one is
Mm,
about the constitution giving these Kenyans powers and freedoms to express themselves openly. And the fact that so many Kenyans have grown up with technology and have been able to harness this to their own advantage at the expense of the government, which has always been a step or two behind these young people. And to this extent, the government actually, I think, it walked into the space quite late after realizing that this aspect of using social media to push for various issues, including the reforms that the young people have been yearning for, has been so successful and has managed to rally young people and even the old people, the millennials and the Gen X, to the advantage of the protesters and those opposing the government. And also the fact that uh, the government, as it is currently, has so many issues, have so many skeletons in its closet, and really wants to suppress it because they know that if it is exposed, then clearly it will lose face in the international community's world. And in the process, this will definitely deal a very big blow to the leaders in place because of the endemic corruption in human rights violations that have been reported before, and those involved have not been taken before any justice, any courts to face justice because of the issue of a culture of impunity that has been in the country from independent days up to now.
Very, very impressive, I must say. Looking at Kenya, especially for the rest of the continent, I think it's a perfect example of what people, especially young people, can do when they hold government accountable and are fearless. Because I think the young people of the continent can only take so much, and I think young people of Kenya have set a really, really brilliant benchmark and example of what could be done. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure chatting to you and for giving us insight on this year's Saba Saba demonstrations. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much and have a good one.
And with that, we've come to the end of our hashtag Africa Focus feature. We'll be back with you right after this.